College football nerds here talking Penn State and Ohio State. I am back from vacation just in time to do this monster game. Josh is with me. We are going to get nerdy with y'all. Maybe a little more numbers than we have been doing recently. Obviously, we got the computer model. It's pretty interesting as well. Josh, get us started with something that we were talking about before we hit play or record. And that is that there's a lot of perception around Penn State, and I feel like it's really, nobody thinks about Penn State outside of that Michigan game. And we've formed an opinion around what we think Penn State is or who they are based on that one game. And I'm kind of fell victim to it myself. But if you look at this game on paper, and you look at the fact that Ohio State is having to travel there, this could be a sneaky game for Ohio State. And I think it's buried a little bit in the numbers. But what they did at Auburn, I think is really impressive. What they did against Minnesota Saturday, I think is pretty impressive. But really, I want you to talk about that Michigan game and how if you just don't look at the score and look at some circumstances around that game and how it kind of got out of hand, we might have a little different perspective on Penn State if we really dive into it.
It's interesting because college football is always a sport that revolves around break points and freeze points, as we call them. I know Josh Pate has his own terminology that he started using off this concept. And I think Penn State kind of got to a point in this game where things got away from them. And when that happens, the score can escalate pretty quickly on you as a football team. And with Penn State, I think that's just kind of what happened. Penn State this year has generally not played all that many defensive snaps in a game. So if you want to talk through some of the different games that Penn State played, one example would be the Northwestern game. They defended 65 snaps. Another example would be the Auburn game. They defended 74. Minnesota, they defended 68 snaps. The thing that I want to get across is at the midway point of the Michigan game, Penn State had defended 55 snaps. That is closing on the average number of snaps defended for certain teams that play low-tempo games, teams that are actually facing, run-first teams. And if you look at, take Michigan, for example, and their offense and the pace that they run, 55 snaps is a lot. I mean, they against Maryland, Michigan only ran 66 plays. Against Hawaii, they only ran 55 in the entire game. Against Iowa, they only ran 66 plays. So what I'm saying is, by the time the dam broke, and remember, Penn State led that game at the half, 17-16, when they had that long run from Edwards, that was right at the 60-play mark. It was effectively an entire game defensed by Penn State, and the defense just wore down. But up to that point, it really was, I think, defined more than anything by an offense that was sort of struggling to find any sort of footing against a Michigan defense. It is very, very good. And with all due respect to our Ohio State brethren, there's maybe some reasons to think Michigan's better. And I'm not even sure we're going to go into that. But just statistically, in a lot of areas, Michigan is arguably up there with Georgia, possibly Alabama. People were going to still trying to parse out the Tennessee game and if that was an aberration or not. But statistically, they're up there with all the top defenses. But the inability to really just sustain a drive means you had 11 plays in the first drive for Michigan, 13 plays in the second drive, 13 plays in the third, interception, touchdown, and then an 11-play drive. So even the pick six that Penn State had went against them because it meant it was another possession Michigan would have the ball. Frankly, they just got exhausted. And they had played an entire game on defense by the time it was 17-24. And from that point on, yeah, they gave up some huge explosive plays, but it's not shocking. They were effectively playing into the game defense. And if you get to that number of snaps and you do it in half the amount of time, you tend to be that much more exhausted. I think they just weren't prepared for it. And due to the length of that game defensively, it's really what caused it to run away. It was a game that ended up running a lot longer than you would have expected. And games that run long tend to be blowouts one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to discredit Michigan on the long runs because those are something that informs on, the actual outcome or score of that game. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to break off a couple of 60-yarders back-to-back if these teams play 10 times in a row. So if you take some of these plays out. And again, Michigan fans are going to say you can't. Our offense is predicated on explosion, and I get that. But I'm just saying, in terms of looking at Penn State and who they are as a team, I don't think that's entirely fair. And I say all this to say, Ohio State, if they win this game, can hang their hat on what I think is beating what I think is a very good team. And, I'm probably going to pick Ohio State in this game, but I think that we need to dispel this myth that Penn State sucks because of one game. I really hate that narrative right now. And I'm about to say something, Josh, and I hope that Ohio State fans don't get upset because we're very, very clear on this show. We have a many-year history of saying this. Just because you haven't played anybody doesn't mean you can't be elite. And that's where Ohio State is right now. They're getting a lot of flack from people saying you haven't played anybody. The implication is you haven't played anybody, therefore you suck. I hate that, but part of it, half of it is right. Ohio State hasn't played anybody yet. The Power 5 plus Notre Dame scoring offenses that Ohio State faced, 80th, 52nd, 102nd, 78th, and 103rd. That 52nd is Wisconsin, and they are not a good offense. They're objectively not a good offense. They haven't played the best passing offense they faced is Auburn at 70th. Or I'm sorry, that's Penn State. The best passing offense they faced is 70th. That's Notre Dame. Rushing offenses, they haven't played anybody that can run the ball. So I say all that to say that Penn State is better than any team they've played in all three of those major metrics. So it could be a situation where if Ohio State comes out rusty, Penn State could shock them and get some early body blows on them and be in that game at halftime like they were against Michigan. So, Josh, talk a little bit about how we can tease out, because you and I both have Ohio State number 1. And again, I want Ohio State fans to understand that. How do you tease out who Ohio State is when they objectively, and Ohio State fans will tell you, haven't really played anybody yet, but we still feel pretty good about them being elite? Obviously, we've got them number 1.
I think you have to kind of compare where Ohio State is as compared to the competition they've played and how those teams have done against other people, right? We do a lot of stuff with opponent averages and, percentage of opponent averages allowed defensively is a big number for us. When you go through and you look at the offensive statistics for Ohio State compared to what other teams are allowing, they're pretty impressive. Wisconsin allowed 7.7 yards per play to Ohio State. That's about 2 yards per play better than anyone else has done, including, Michigan State, Purdue, Washington State, Northwestern, not great teams, but they were all pushing about 5 yards per play. Similar deal like Arkansas State, not a good football team, but 10 yards per play is a crazy number against anyone, which is what Ohio State put up. And even against some, decent teams like Memphis, it's like 7.5 yards per play. Same deal. You can talk about Michigan State, right? Michigan State played Washington, gave up 6.6 yards per play. Played Minnesota, who's a pretty good team, gave up 6.9. Played Maryland, gave up 6.4. Played Ohio State, 8.3. 2 yards per play higher. So the biggest thing I can say from all those stats is, when they've offensively, they are consistently like a tier or two better statistically than anyone has done against every team they play. And that's a huge deal. That's the biggest thing when we look at to see if you're elite is typically when you play an elite team, and people always struggle with this. I think it's why we do well sometimes with like Ohio State fans and Georgia fans and Alabama fans versus others, because their team plays Ohio State and they expect us to say, oh, it's going to be a tight game and a close game and this is the best Minnesota team in ages. And we'll say, no, I think you're going to give up more yards than you ever have. And they go, oh, what? No, we've never given up this many. We've never given up 600 yards in a game. Michigan State didn't give up 600 yards in a game. They never gave up 550 yards in a game, except the Ohio State game where they gave up over 600. It's typical with elite teams, and they do show that on the offensive side of the ball. I think the problem, as you said, is evaluating them really defensively, given that schedule, because the offenses they faced have been very anemic, and that does kind of really limit your ability to evaluate. And that same conversation, right, the fact that Ohio State's consistently like 2 yards per play better against every team they face doesn't hold true on the offensive side of the ball. So take Notre Dame, for example. And I know that was week 1, and it was a sort of a tough game and a weird game for Ohio State, but Ohio State had 5.3 yards per play. Well, North Carolina gains 6.8. Or excuse me, Notre Dame had 6.8 yards per play on North Carolina, but they only had 4.7 on Marshall. They only had 4.6 on Cal. They had 4.9 on Stanford, 5.7 on UNLV. That 5.3 yard per play was actually a very average number for Notre Dame offensively. Ohio State didn't do anything particularly special in that regard. And it's not just Notre Dame. Something I'm going to mention, and it's probably going to irk some people, but it needs to be said. In terms of, just overall performance offensively against Iowa last week, yeah, you scored a lot of points. And it was 54-10, but it was a lot of points because Iowa's offense is so bad, and it was so bad before the Ohio State game. It's been a meme-worthy thing for us like 3 times a Saturday that it handed points like crazy. But Ohio State in the first half was averaging about 4 yards per play. And on the game, it came out to about 5.8. Notre Dame, Ohio State had 5.7 yards per play. Iowa, they had 5.8 yards per play. And so now you start to realize the picture of that Iowa game, for example. Yeah, the score got big because of how atrocious Iowa is on the offensive side of the ball, that they gave them a lot of points. They gave them a ton of short fields, and everything sort of collapsed. I do think Ohio State's offense is really good, but I think defensively, shutting down Iowa, it's great. It's great to say that you held them to 2.7 yards per play. So did South Dakota State. So did Iowa State. They held them to 2.9. So it gets really hard to evaluate, and I do think we're in a situation where Ohio State is the best offense in the country. I think the defense, from a statistical perspective, kind of looks like they're just merely good. And maybe they haven't played anyone that's good enough for them to show up statistically, because that does happen. If everybody's terrible that you're playing, you can't really hold teams to 0 yards on any consistent basis. It's not realistic. But the teams are so bad that the offense, yeah, they can show out and they go crazy. But the defensive numbers, as good as they are, they actually aren't that out of the ordinary.
I'll give a little pushback there, though, and we've talked about this in the past. When you're modeling teams and you're looking at numbers, if a defensive team plays a bunch of horrible offenses, it's hard to hold them below their average, because as you approach 0 on that curve, like if somebody averages 1.5 yards a carry, holding them to 1 yard per carry is utterly impossible. So from the yards per play average and the scoring average, they've played terrible teams, but gosh, they held Iowa to 3 points. Iowa is one of the worst offenses I've ever seen, but they still didn't do the thing that we saw Ohio State do. They had knucklehead moments against bad offenses in the past. That's the thing that Ohio State fans are saying. You just eliminate those knucklehead moments. You just give us a top 15 defense, and our offense is so good that it doesn't matter. So I think that when we think of elite teams like Alabama this year, Tennessee weirdness aside, for them to win a national championship, they need a top 5 defense because their offense is so hit or miss. Georgia, same thing. They have to have a top 5 defense. Ohio State doesn't. So what you're saying is merely good. They might take that right now. And the question is, are they excellent? I don't know, because it's so hard to judge because they haven't played anybody. Let's talk about what the model says. And I want to get into a little bit of emotional stuff later, because people tell us all the time that games aren't played on paper or in spreadsheets, and I agree with that. But the model is, and other data is, information that we use to get there. Let's talk about what the model says and then do some picks off of that.
Right. So we've got this model that's a sort of a per play relational model. And I'll say there was an adjustment we had to make for Tennessee a couple weeks ago where Tennessee had scored so many points in every game, and they were kind of breaking the model a little bit, that I decided to do some tweaks to try to force the model to have an upper and lower bounds and sort of tie it to some things. It's not a point per play linear model, but it sort of creates some internal curves and things, and it wasn't really tethered well enough. That kludging stuff I did to Tennessee, I actually have refined it, and I'll tell you that I have rolled that in for every team in every model. So going forward, that number's kind of in there, and you're going to see the results. Like the scoring numbers are going to be a little bit more compressed. They're not quite going to be quite as high for everybody in a lot of instances, but I do think at the end of the day, it's probably going to make things a little more accurate, a little less wild as compared to where we were at earlier this year. And in that refrain, I think the model is kind of interesting here. The predicted score is Ohio State 31, Penn State 19. The defensive statistics don't necessarily pan out with what I was saying earlier. I mean, Ohio State is giving up 77% of opponent rushing averages, 84% of opponent passing averages. Those are respectively good numbers. Now, that kind of comes down to the fact that it's a little hard to gauge some of these teams, and I think some numbers are kind of inflated, right? Wisconsin is actually 13th in the country right now, I believe, in yards per attempt average, but they're in the 80s in total passing yardage. Wisconsin throws so infrequently that if all you're doing is throwing very rare play action passes, yeah, you do have a pretty decent yard per attempt number, but it doesn't really mean anything. And there's some stuff like that that's a little wonky, right? That, Notre Dame's passing average is in the sevens. Arkansas State's is in the sevens. I'm not sure how realistic all that is. Just to say that 77%, 84% number, I know it feels like I'm really dinging Ohio State, but I'm just saying it probably a little bit inflated. Those numbers are pushing the very good territory to elite territory. They're not elite. They're just merely good to very good. Even there, though, I'm a little cautious.
Just to give some context to that, for what I was saying before, in the past, we've seen Ohio State numbers that are over 100%. Like 105, I think, was their passing numbers last year. It was something like that, maybe 2020. I don't remember. But we've seen Ohio State with nowhere, like this is a huge improvement compared to the previous defenses we've seen for Ohio State.
Right. Yeah, this is probably about 20% better than it had been under Coombs. It's about 20% better. So this is a huge step forward, but it's a huge step forward to go from what was bad to good. This is good to very good range. It's not, these numbers are not elite. Even then, I think they're probably a touch higher than they would be, or maybe should be. But, I think realistically 80% to 87% run, 87% pass is about what the adjustment I'd make. Maybe I'm being too ticky-tacky. In terms of Penn State's numbers, I think it's interesting because their numbers are actually pretty darn bad. And Michigan really hit that home. But even going into the Michigan game, we kind of flagged that their statistical numbers in our model and our relativity model are not great. 102% of opponent rushing averages is a bad run defense. Straight up bad. You are worse than average for most teams. 82% against the pass is the interesting number because that's actually a rather good number. Anything in the 70s I consider to be very good into elite. Both these teams are kind of pushing to that. But 82% is very good. And what that really does is it kind of skews with the way that Ohio State wants to play. Ohio State is a very balanced team, almost exactly 50-50. 50-50 balance, down to like the decimal point. But they are, from a productivity standpoint, more driven by the pass. 10.5 yards per attempt and 5.5 yards per carry. That's a good rush number, but the passing number is the number that's so crazy. And Penn State's ability to limit the pass keeps this to a somewhat respectable per play yardage differential, 7.1 yards per play to 5 yards per play. And that 31 points may seem kind of low if you're an Ohio State fan when you've been scoring 45 plus since week 2. But the thing I would note is from a yard per play perspective, the model is saying, this is kind of on the low end of what you could possibly expect. It's about the same kind of numbers you put up against Rutgers, a little better than you put up against Iowa, but without the same just cataclysmic stuff going wrong to give you free points is essentially what the model's saying. And it does think Penn State's offense at 5 yards per play, that's a competent offensive football game. It's not certainly the best they've had, but it's more than they had against Northwestern. Maybe about the same they had against Michigan is what it's projecting. And, Penn State did score some points on Michigan. They did move the ball some. 19 points is not an impossible thing to get to, and that's how you get to the final 31-19. It's very good production from Ohio State, but not enough to get to that breaking point where they just run away from the score. And Penn State has just enough production where they get past the freeze point, right? The offense does move some. They do have some opportunity to get first downs, some opportunities to have 1 or 2 long drives in the game. And so that kind of compresses it to the middle where Ohio State can't quite run away from it and do everything they want to do to where they score 50. And they can't quite shut down Penn State enough to where Penn State's held to like 6 points in the game. And whenever that happens, you end up, in that 31-17 kind of score range.
So Vegas has this at a 61.5 over under, which I think is high. Maybe not that high. But a 15-point spread. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about emotion and a little bit about intangibles. I think if Penn State was playing this game right after Michigan, it'd be one thing. But they had a bit of an emotional boost with clobbering Minnesota. That crowd's going to be lathered up. And I think Alabama has some weird road things going on that are systemic within that they play too tight on the road. But I also think that what we've seen in the last couple of years is even really good teams or elite teams that are monster favorites on the road in hostile environments against competent teams that struggle to cover. And I don't think that I can't remember, but I don't think that Ohio State covered here last time. I think that some of those intangibles are going to play in Penn State's favor for about 3/4. I've got Ohio State winning but not covering 34-24, and that's close enough to me that I'm giving Penn State a puncher's chance. And I think that really just says something to me about college football this year, and maybe, one, the parity that is present, and two, I think we need to throw out this notion that home field advantage is worth 3 points. That's kind of the thing that people say when they're doing these point spreads. I think home field advantage in environments like Beaver Stadium, in environments like at LSU, are worth 6, 7 or more points. Neutral field, I think Ohio State handles this pretty good, but I could see Penn State being in this game in the fourth quarter. Tell me what you got.
Yeah, and I already tipped my hand. I'm going to say 31-17. Look, predicting an exact score is nigh impossible. Sometimes we get really close, which always kind of shocks me. But this feels like a 2-touchdown game to me. And I will say, from a yardage perspective, Michigan allowed about 5.2 yards per play to Penn State. Penn State scored 17 points. You look at the model, right? Ohio State's current percentage of opponent averages allowed, 77% run, 84% pass. You know what Michigan was at the time they played Penn State? 77% run, 83% pass. Almost the exact same number. Now, Penn State gets a little more credit here because their offense has actually improved statistically in our model since then, just ever so slightly. But I think Penn State's going to move the ball about like they did against Michigan, and I think they're probably going to give up plays like they did against Michigan, and they're going to get scored on. The problem was Penn State as a team, and this shows up in our statistics, is a bad run defense. Even in the Michigan game, it's not just that game. They were already in the 90s in terms of percentage of rushing averages allowed as of the Michigan game, and it only has kind of gotten worse. So they were bit hard by Michigan's strength and explosiveness in the run. And I'm not saying Ohio State isn't an explosive run game, but quite frankly, they're not as explosive as Michigan is. They're a lot more explosive in the passing game. I would say a lot more consistently explosive in the passing game. But Penn State is a good pass defense. And so I think that is going to hold Ohio State into a lot more check than the Michigan game, which again was a game they were leading at the half and it got blown open by big runs. I think Ohio State is going to score and they're going to pull away in this game. I think it's going to be a little bit harder than it was Michigan. They're not going to have that dam break moment where Michigan had due to their run game and pounding on Penn State. Ohio State's going to find it a little more difficult to wear Penn State out because of the way they play football, and they're playing more into Penn State's strengths defensively, which I think is going to limit the score. I do think the 15-point spread is a pretty solid spread. The 60-point over-under is interesting because that's suggesting that they actually think Penn State could score into the 20s or upper 20s. That doesn't shock me either, especially since they seem to find some things last week. Yeah, it's an interesting game, and I think some people, due to that Michigan blowout, are just sort of assuming Penn State was a total pretender and it's going to be a cakewalk. I don't think that's true. I think Penn State's going to put up a fight. I think Penn State, we've said all year when Penn State fans were coming at us, right, that I didn't think Penn State was a top 10 team. And I reluctantly put them in there right before they lost, only because I kind of had to. But I've also said that I really think they're a team that's a top 20 team. I think they're somewhere in that 10 to 20 range. I think Ohio State's going to discover that this is the best team they've played. And I'm going to steal a little bit of your thunder before I throw it back to you, Daniel. if you look at scoring offenses, passing offenses, rushing offenses that Ohio State's faced, the best scoring offense was 52nd. The best passing offense, throwing out Wisconsin, which they're 90th in total yards, but per play they're way better than they should be due to infrequency. But 70th is really the best passing offense. And rushing offense, best that Ohio State faced is 47th. In every one of those categories, Penn State is better. They are a better passing team than anyone Ohio State has faced. They are a better rushing team than anyone Ohio State has faced. They are a better scoring team, better yard per play team than anyone Ohio State has faced. There is reason to think that they're going to score more points than Ohio State is used to. They are better in every facet in the game. I don't think they're elite. They're the number 39 scoring offense. They're not elite. But Ohio State, frankly, hasn't played anyone that is a top 50 scoring offense. So that competency is going to keep Penn State in that game. I think people are going to be a little uncomfortable with it, but it's just going to be a reflection of the fact that Penn State is a solid football team, and they're not a team that you can just brush aside so easily. And if it is a 1-2 touchdown win, that is not a poor reflection to me of Ohio State. I think Penn State's just a team that's capable of playing with people to that level, and I think the Michigan blowout was a little bit of an aberration and not quite who Penn State is.
You didn't steal my thunder because I made that point earlier with those numbers, but that's okay. Ohio State fans are going to needle you a little bit in the comments, and y'all go ahead and do that. Get ready. You spent this whole video trashing their defense. I know you didn't, but that's what they're going to say. You spent this whole thing trashing their defense, and then you're saying that they're going to give up the same amount of points that Michigan did, which, hey, I think that if that happens, that's a good signal that Ohio State is maybe better defensively than we're giving them credit. All right, y'all, let us know in the comments how wrong Josh is about Ohio State's defense, which really he's saying you're good, and I think you know that. And give us your score prediction for this game. Thanks for making it this far and a long one, but this is a lot to talk about. This is a huge game in college football and landscape this year. I'm going to sign off by saying if this game is closer and Ohio State wins it, Michigan fans who are watching, don't do the transitive property thing because they'll just do Iowa back at you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.